Hi, I want to talk with you about diverse paths in the early part of the second half of last century, maybe starting through the 60s, 50s, 60s, and going up probably until the 90s, where so much of group psychotherapy and psychotherapy itself was very much a theory building, technique experimentation. So, um, as group therapy progressed, much like psychotherapy in general, there were different branches of the tree or different subsidiaries of the main river of psychotherapy. And let's start with psychodynamic orientation, some of the major ones, and then maybe let's move into some cognitive approaches. So during this time period, say starting in 1960, psychodynamic orientations produced an outpouring of theory and technique. I'd say particularly from, say, object relations, intersubjective psychology, sometimes referred to as interrelational psychotherapy, self-psychology, and I'd say modern analytic are probably the major schools of thought in terms of group theory. So psychodynamically oriented uh, papers usually try to link the personality theory that they engage in, believe in, and with how they will get manifested in group processes. Um, I think the downside of this is that psychodynamic theory then, and I would say to a degree now, kind of overlooks or maybe even devalues the strong importance of having a varied and full empirical basis for their views and methods. I think I had a personal experience of this. I was at a group conference uh, talking at a party with many modern analytic group leaders. I've been in modern analysis for about 30 years myself. Um, and Many people knew me and were talking to me. Then people were introducing me and saying, "Oh, this is Francis." And they said, "Oh, you should go see Francis's talk tomorrow." And they said, "Oh, Francis, what's your talk on?" And I said, "Oh, it's kind of like how we merge together kind of theory, technique with the current research." And they said, "Research?" And then they'd walk away. And this isn't a joke. This had actually happened, usually in a disproving, dismissive kind of way. So it reminded me a little bit of kind of dismissive attachment style, that meaning that they thought they were uh, good and they thought the other, me in this case, was less than. Uh, so psychodynamic views could continue to kind of engage, I think, in more research methodologies and research studies. Now, on the other hand, you had these cognitive behavioral and psychoeducational models, which I think kind of lack the depth and the interest maybe around some of the personality factors that were illuminated in psychodynamic theory. But in spite of this, these kind of non-relational, non-psychodynamically oriented approaches were able to operationalize an empirically based treatment protocol that showed to have strong effectiveness. Uh, so let's start with probably the most widely utilized psychodynamic theory that was developed during this period, which I would call object relations therapy. We've talked a little bit about Klein and Bion and Tavistock in earlier lectures, and I'll probably say a little bit more about this and hopefully provide a little more depth to what it was said earlier. So, object relations, I think, is almost like an umbrella term. These various people kind of focus in different ways on it, and object relations itself also has many branches sprouting off from Klein. I think you could easily put interpersonal psychotherapy. I think you could put attachment theory. I think you could put contemporary relational approaches or relational psychoanalytic approaches in this as having its grounding in object relations theory. So as opposed to kind of Freud's drive first, objects later perspective, meaning that the drives of pleasure and aggression were the primary focus. Sometimes you hear classical analysts say you focus on the drives and then the objects will take care of themselves, meaning that you may help people notice their various feelings of desire for pleasure, avoidance of pain on one hand, and then maybe also their variety of aggressiveness and how they work with that, whether they accept that in, whether they're destructive or potentially having the ability to be constructive with annoyance to make a better change in the world. It makes me think of my wife, who got very, very politically active out of her frustration and anger in national and local politics, and kind of focus that anger to get a very, very active, organize, and do a tremendous amount of canvassing, and had positive outcomes in our elections. So Freud and many kind of post-classical analytic schools were really focused on the drives. I think Klein really focused on the internalized objects or the part objects. She kind of went along with Freud, but felt like these objects that were cathected, one of my favorite analytic terms, or say attached to either the sex, love, constructive, pleasure, whatever variety of that kind of light drive that you might adhere to, would be the objects of exploration, and then also kind of the objects that kind of caught the hatred drive. She felt that the Oedipal conflict began very early in life, much earlier than Freud, in about the first year of life. She went on to describe kind of three primary positions that people kind of go through and potentially live in. Kind of the early paranoid position is kind of relating to the world in terms of good and bad, black and white. Like in my early example, they were good, they were modern analyst group leaders. I was bad, I was someone interested in research. So that's the paranoid position. The schizoid position is kind of a relational fusion filled with kind of poor reality testing and kind of extensive fantasy life. I have someone in one of my groups here who I've been trying to help, who's a clinician themselves, and they kind of go back and forth with the idea that they are the best therapist to the worst therapist, and then they have very extensive fantasies of both unbridled narcissistic success and admiration and damnation and not being able to keep one client. Now this is more of like a floating kind of ego state, I'd say, in this person, but I thought it's very representative when that person is there of this kind of schizoid position. Oftentimes you'll hear this referred to as the paranoid schizoid position because there is quite a bit of overlapping, and some people see this as one position. And then after this, there's the depressive position, in which the good and bad parts of objects are kind of integrated, and the fantasy of a wholly benevolent world is abandoned. The fantasy of being a wonderful person all the time is abandoned. Potentially the fantasy of a perfect love soulmate kind of idea, I might say, is abandoned. So Klein had kind of a darker view in some ways, although as someone who's been with my partner for 26, 27 years, I would say not only have I seen the good and bad in them, which has been painful. I think what may have been even more painful is after all this time, they can see the good and bad in myself, and I know they can see the good and bad in me. And we still go forward. Although Klein called this a depressive position, I think it's kind of a freeing position. So Klein's work, is ever present in Beyond, and we talked about Beyond some last time. But I'd also say that one of Klein's other analysans and students, Fairbairn, also had a profound impact. Fairbairn kind of discarded these kind of dual drive theories of Freud and Klein of pleasure, love, sex, relationship, and destruction, on the other hand, kind of in a primary, highly focused on a relational drive, that is what biologically we are driven to do as human beings. And because of this, our drive for relationships, we will be inevitably frustrated in our relationships because no relationship is a perfect fit. He would say that kind of this dyadic approach that you see in so much of kind of psychotherapy literature, he would think that people would kind of put people into rejecting or exciting objects or rejecting and exciting people in their lives. I see this in group all the time, that people are very much drawn to the other group members who they feel are rejecting of them or in some way high stimulation talkers, extroverts. But for Fairbairn, this kind of drive for connection in relationship and the frustration of this is where pathology came from. I think you can see this in kind of an oft-quoted object relations group theory that says, always think of your group members, no matter how frustrating or confusing they are in group, they are doing their absolute best to form connections with other people. And I think about this often, and if someone is being quiet or talking too much or telling the stories about their trauma or a boring story about work, that in some way this is their best attempts to form connections. So I think when we think of Klein, we also think of one of her kind of other famous analysans, which is Winnicott. And this idea, one of his major ideas, I think, is play, and that the group psychotherapy form, I think, actually can be a playground for people to explore their communication styles, can explore their relational styles, can actually have fun, can flirt, can joke, can do many things in terms of play. But I also think in terms of a leader, Winnicott's idea of psychotherapy, and in this case, group psychotherapy as a holding environment, it kind of assists in kind of personality integration and kind of integration in the movement of the group moving forward. I talked to a colleague of mine who just led a large group with about 30 people for several hours, and she told me that in that time she said one thing once as a leader, and I think she said something like, I'm confused about the meaning or the potential meanings of laughter in this group. And she wondered if she did not enough. She actually wondered if she did too much. But she talked on and on about her experience of holding the confusion, feeling it in her body, kind of transforming it, continuing her presence throughout this. So I think kind of out of these kind of object relations ideas, you kind of see the work of Margaret Mahler and the early attachment ideas. The idea of kind of separation and individuation, and then rapprochement that you might see. And I see this in my group members all the time, where there'll be times when they're bonded with me, they'll fight with me, they'll disagree with me, And then in some forms they'll try to come back and make nice. They'll think I'm very mad at them for individuating. I think that's partially a transference, if not primarily a transference. I think our group members are like our children. We want them to be independent and to live the lives of joy and happiness, the lives that they want. So that's a little bit about kind of the underlying theory of basic object relations. So if we're going to get into the group theory of it, it's a perfect fit. I mean, object relations is about relationships, and group psychotherapy is about relationships. So I think the goal of object relations groups is kind of to bring into consciousness the internal representations that the group members have, that they enact in the group, and that are most likely problematic or healthy, that occur outside the group. So if someone says only way of interacting is through being, say in their family they were the one who would bring the intensity to humor, you'll see that occurring in group over and over. And you might be able to see over time in group for this member how they're seeing this as their role, and how they're probably having fantasies and transferences. If they don't do that, what might happen to the other members of the group. And then once you kind of work through your transferences towards the other members of the group, you kind of work through your transferences with people in the world. So these interactions in object relation oriented groups, the kind of job is to kind of highlight these repetitive patterns, to get people to say how they're seeing each other, tease apart the group transferences. I would also say you kind of study the hierarchy of defenses. I used humor in this last example, one of Valiant's high levels of kind of defense strategies. But you can also kind of start trying to study potentially other kind of defense mechanisms of sublimation, projection. We talked about repetition, projective identification, which I think I'll talk about a little bit here and probably multiple times more throughout the talk. I think it's very important as a therapist, particularly working from depth approaches, and very important to a group leader, I think, to understand this. So projective identifications comes from Klein, and when people are infants are unable to kind of grok the complexity of their parents, and would kind of split things into good and bad, and in some ways may not be able to show their level of frustration or aggression. It gets kind of learn that that's not helpful to do with their caregivers, and then in some way give that feeling, it could be many feelings, over to their caregiver, and then the caregiver may feel these things. So I think the goal here as a parent, as it is as a group leader, is to contain these feelings and to study these feelings. So progressive identification it's a regressive defense very early. In some ways it can be used to kind of create some kind of structure of one experience. It can elicit empathetic responses. And I think in some ways it's given to the leader to hold, and the leader can slowly give back the projective identification experience. I think of an example I often think of is particularly in Boulder. I meet somebody and they tell me how wonderful their life is, what in great shape they are, their wonderful friendships, yoga practice, meditation practice, and I walk away from that interaction generally feeling very bad about myself in a way that's different than the way I experience envy, but in a way that's different than how I typically feel bad about myself, but in some way holding their disowned pieces of themselves. I think another classic Boulder example is that I meet someone who says everything is, and it's somewhat similar, everything is great, things are moving forward in the world, everything is tremendously wonderful, it's so great to see me, and I walk away feeling kind of agitated or even angry. I think when I worked a lot with people who smoked a lot of marijuana, this is my experience, that their own aggression, frustration, anger were disowned and in some way given onto me. I think some other techniques you'll find in object relations therapy is use of metaphors. People will be encouraged to share dreams. Groups will be encouraged to free associate without having a cognitive exact relational object they're talking to, or necessarily making any kind of logic coherent sense the way we think about logic, but maybe we'll explore this logic as we do in free association after the fact, because the unconscious does have a logic. We just need to try to take some time to reflect to understand what it is. So I think, the goals are very ambitious in object relations therapy. I think it's actually kind of personality change, changing the way you think about yourself and you think about others, the way you are with others, the way you feel emotionally towards others, actually the way you feel when you're around others in your body. So it's a very dramatic goal that they're seeking here. I think some more minor goals might be kind of better social adaptation, social skills, reduction of symptoms, I think. So that's a little bit of an introduction to object relations therapy. I think I'll stop there. Maybe we'll go on, talk a little bit more about the interplay of object relations therapy and the Tavistock model, which we talked about a little bit in an earlier lecture.